Kane Thornton. I'm the Chief Executive of the Clean Energy Council. Welcome to this fantastic session here in the Australian Pavilion. Isn't it great to be back with some colleagues from around the nation and the best coffee at the entire COP. I've got a feeling some people are just in this pavilion for the coffee, but that's fine, whatever it takes. We look forward to your engagement in this session on Australia's enormous opportunity and potential for offshore wind. I want to start with an acknowledgement of the traditional First Nations Australians and recognise elders past, present and future that may be with us today. And I must say one of my observations from attending COPs over the years has been the growing prominence of First Nations voices from around the world and indeed Australian First Nations people in COP in all of its machinations, and I think that's been a fantastic development. This topic that we're going to spend the next 50 minutes talking on, I think, is one that rather unusually for Australia, we haven't been leading the world on offshore wind. We've certainly led the world in other renewables in all sorts of ways. There'll be topics of discussions in other forums throughout the course of the next week. But what we know is that is now changing. Australia has recognised the enormous potential for offshore wind. We have one of the world's best offshore wind resources, and I think probably in particular from this moment last year, we've got our skates on in developing out the offshore wind opportunity, and that's really going to be the topic of conversation here on this panel. As I said, we've got some of the best offshore wind resources in the world. We've got an enormous amount of coastline, wind resources in the order of 8 to 10 metres per second. We have a strong and united political and regulatory environment. We haven't always been able to say that, but we've got governments, state and federal and indeed local, working with a range of regulatory bodies to put in place the policy and regulatory environment that we need. And we've increasingly got a highly motivated and capable industry, I think, bringing together the global capability and experience, some of which you're going to hear from on the panel today, marrying that up with really our domestic and very experienced renewable sector and supply chain. We've got the foundations now being put together. We've got 2 areas now formally declared by the federal government, 2 more open for consultation, and a lot of work really on the regulatory framework that's underway. Areas declared, more than 23,000 square kilometres. I feel like I'm stealing some of Kushla's thunder shortly, but enormous amount of progress, obviously. And we've had projects announced thus far to the order of 54 gigawatts. In fact, that statistic is about a month old now, so I've got a feeling it's more than 54 gigawatts, but an enormous amount of projects that have been identified and announced publicly. We've also got state governments obviously leaning in heavily, and particularly recognise the state of Victoria, who's taken some decisive steps, put in place some ambitious targets and following through with policy to help deliver those. We've got a lot to do to catch up. As I said, we're back in the game, I think, as far as offshore wind. We have a lot to do, a lot of collaboration. I think we've got a lot to learn from the progress that's been made internationally, and we'll be sharing some reflections on that throughout the course of this discussion. Let me introduce the panel. It's an extraordinary panel of individuals in no particular order. Firstly, Kushla Munro, who's the Division Head International on Climate Change with DQ. You hardly need an introduction in this pavilion, do you, Kushla? Leading all things international, strategic, climate and carbon market policy with an extensive career across government, including DFAT and PM&C. Michael Hannibal, who is the partner at Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners, leading their offshore wind program. CIP obviously have been very active and leading through the Star of the South project, the most advanced offshore wind project in Australia. And Michael, if you don't know, has an extraordinary career in offshore wind, having been involved in the very first offshore wind project in the world in 2009, and then a lengthy period as CEO of Siemens Offshore Wind for over 7 years. So welcome to you, Michael. Jonathan Cole, welcome Jonathan, the CEO of Corio, For those of you who are from the Geelong region of Victoria, that's not Corio, it is Corio, which was launched in 2022 out of the Macquarie Asset Management portfolio, an offshore wind portfolio now of over 30 gigawatts across the world. And Jonathan previously ran Iberdrola's offshore wind business from 2010 to 2021, and is also, and I know a very active role here at COP, he is also the chair of the Global Wind Energy Council, and I'm sure he'll share some reflections on the global wind industry. We will also be joined shortly by Rebecca Williams, who is the Global Head of Offshore Wind with the Global Wind Energy Council. So Rebecca is on her way and will be joining us on the final seat shortly. So as you can see, we've amassed quite an extraordinary delegation from both Australia and internationally to explore this topic. I'm going to take a seat and we're going to get stuck into a great conversation. There'll be an opportunity towards the end for questions from the floor, so please be at the ready for that. Seamless transition. Yes, we've got audio, so yeah, thank you. Michael, I might start with you, given your experience globally. As I said, I think we've got a lot to learn, but really interested firstly in your reflections on the opportunity in Australia and the offshore wind opportunity, how that stacks up to what you've seen elsewhere around the world.
Yeah, you can say our interest in offshore wind Australia started actually back in 2015, where at that time I was Siemens, where I met the founders of Star of the South, and they approached me in a conference in London and said they want to do offshore wind in Australia, and I said, how crazy can that be? Why should you do that? You have so much land. Then we looked into it in Siemens and said this is actually not so bad. Then I joined CIP in 2017 and basically got engaged with the project. So in CIP we have worked with Star of the South since 2017, and the fundamentals for the project is super well. There's really good wind condition. The seabed in Gippsland is super for offshore wind. The way that the offshore wind in Gippsland is working, you can say complementary to onshore wind and solar, is huge. So actually when there's zero wind, if you go west of Melbourne, then there's plenty of wind in the Gippsland due to thermal winds and so on. So the fundamentals for the Star of the South is really high. Then we have looked at more markets or more states, and actually Australia have fantastic fundamentals for offshore wind. And I think we should congratulate Federal with all the good work they have done. It's amazing to see. I had the pleasure of negotiating an exploration license with Angus Taylor back in time for the Star of the South. And that was where it was really virgin, and the initial discussions with Federal. And seeing how this have now developed into a regime actually working really efficiently, creating a volume market is fantastic to see. And lately, what happened last week with the support from Federal on the offtake side was basically what some of the final parts missing. So a huge congratulations to Federal for the good hard work, and also for the states to now engage and bringing offshore wind in as a complementary thing in the energy mix.
Great, you've covered some of the field that we'll come back to again shortly. Kushal, do you want to maybe just share some reflections? I mean, over the past year, as I said, the Australian government's made enormous progress. I guess some reflections on, how the government sees offshore wind in the portfolio of renewables in the future, and maybe if you want to respond to Michael's compliments in terms of the progress on the regulatory side. I think it's been very significant over the past 12 months.
Thank you, Kane, and welcome on behalf of the Australian government for people who haven't been at the pavilion. A little bit of Aussie homeland right here with our flat whites in particular. But more seriously, on the offshore wind, we actually had a great session yesterday with the Global Wind Council and colleagues from across Asia Pacific. And it just actually made me reflect, because it was in Glasgow actually, where we had just passed the offshore wind primary legislation. And it's kind of stark just how quickly that has moved in the last couple of years, but in particularly this year has just been phenomenal in terms of actually going out, doing the consultation. So it's Gippsland and Hunter, but there's the other 4 to 5 about to come as well. Funnily enough, I just came out of a solar event, and it's just a reflection in terms of, hadn't heard this term, but you probably know it, the solar coaster, in terms of when things are hot, everyone wants to be there. And there's always a question, will offshore wind really make sense? But Michael, when you're speaking and that depth of knowledge and understanding about the global industry and where Australia could really benefit from the offshore wind, it just sort of gives you that hope, but it's also that confidence. And I think more importantly, through the experience of just like the core fundamentals of a regulatory regime being in place. Regulators, as well as those on the policy side, and this is speaking on behalf of government, it's just clear that is the absolute fundamental role that government can play. The question going ahead, I think, will be about, of course, what's the value of that wind resource, because it's also quite particular, the role that the federal government will play with the state governments, and we had our colleague from the Victorian government with us yesterday to talk about that, but that is absolutely critical. But then, the sort of barriers that we'll get into in terms of the sort of offtake agreements, but the skilled workforce, you can talk a lot more about that. For a federal government, I think we're just seized by the fact of we have time that we need to make up. For a federal government, what is it that you do in terms of the skills agenda? So we have big national skills agreements. This is just the mainstreaming of these things into the fundamentals of what this will take, because it's not something abnormal. This is absolutely the new normal. So just getting the fundamentals right and letting the industry grow is where the Australian government's positioning.
Great, thanks, Kushla. Welcome, Rebecca. I've already given you an intro, so we'll come to you shortly. Jonathan, do you want to comment? I mean, as a global player, I mean, the work that's being progressed in Australia, the regulatory and licensing regime, and we'll come back and talk about things like workforce and supply chain and some of the infrastructure. But as far as that regulatory regime, I mean, what's your assessment of how that's progressing? What are the next steps, and how important is that for ultimately moving towards investment decisions?
Sure. Okay. So I think actually Australia is a wonderful case in point for the argument that it's never too late to get started. And one of the things that you worry a lot about at conferences like this is whether we are too late. There's this Chinese proverb that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time to plant a tree is today, right? And I think if you look at how far Australia has come in that short period, it's quite amazing. I mean, if you were talking to an Australian maybe, over the past 10 years, you'd be as likely to hear a question about whether climate change is real as not. Now, as a Glaswegian, I don't feel any sense of embarrassment saying that, because in Glasgow, you'd be likely to hear a question about whether climate change is a bad thing, because in Glasgow we kind of think that a bit of global warming might help improve the summers. But the transformation in terms of the regulatory approach, the attitude that we can catch up is quite amazing. And what I think Australia has done really smartly is it has looked around the world at what's been going on, what's worked and what hasn't, and then it's taken those lessons back home and it's tailored them to be implemented to suit the point in time that we're at in Australia. And then if you look at what's actually happening in Australia, setting targets, right, which are ambitious but credible targets, is a really important first step. But targets are only a first step, and then very quickly developers look behind the targets and see what the framework is. So then starting to look at some of the enablers to hit those targets. So setting out quite clear leasing rounds to allocate seabed, and to allocate seabed at quite high volumes, which is really important to get the market stimulated and to make a market, not just one or two projects, right? So that process is underway. And then if you look more specifically, I mean, especially in places like Victoria, where they've been really progressive, you're then looking at the next level of barrier like grid, and actually saying, right, if we're going to be at 2 gigawatts by 2032, we need the grid to be ready. So VicGrid have been empowered to go and get on and get that ready. And that's taking away a bottleneck that's happening everywhere else. Ports is usually a bottleneck, you know, looking at investment into Hastings ports and encouraging early engagement with all the other ports down there. So doing things that are not just target setting and putting projects into the market, but then trying to address some of the typical bottlenecks and barriers that have been experienced in Europe. And I think that's a real example. In any other country that's looking at whether they should be setting up an offshore wind program would do very well, actually, to come and look at how it's been done in Australia and how it's been set up there.
Thanks, Jonathan. Rebecca, I mean, GWEC does great work. In fact, it's 12 months since the Global Offshore Wind Alliance was signed up. It was at COP27. And a lot of progress through that, obviously bringing together engaged regions and countries, sharing lessons and insights. I mean, maybe from your perspective, in terms of what's happening globally in relation to offshore wind, particularly on the sort of policy, licensing, regulatory environment, what do you think the lessons are for Australia? What should we not do? What should we double down and accelerate on at this point in time?
Well, firstly, profuse apologies for being late. Had an authentic COP experience of being kettled in the wrong zone and having a very panicky run across the site. So apologies for that. But getting back to the topic of offshore wind, firstly, also congratulations to Australia and also to the state of Victoria, I think it's fair to say, because we have really seen an acceleration, as Jonathan was saying, in ambition from Australia, but also in terms of implementation. And I think that's what's so exciting for us as a global community and as GWEC representing that global investor perspective. I think that Australia has so far done a fantastic job actually of looking at international best practice and of bringing that to the market. So well done everyone who's been responsible for that so far. Kane, you touched there on the Global Offshore Wind Alliance, and this is another area where we've seen Australia really kind of grasp the opportunity with both hands, both at federal and at state level. So we, in August, saw the Australian federal government, and the state of Victoria has also recently now joined the Global Offshore Wind Alliance, which is a multi-stakeholder diplomatic initiative. So it brings together countries and governments at a subnational level with investors and with other kind of stakeholders in the offshore wind space to drive progress and to share lessons learning. So again, a really exciting opportunity. And I think what we're seeing now is that GOA is starting to get into the detail of some of these conversations, which are going to be really important for the continued ambition and implementation of offshore wind in Australia. So looking at the topics of regional collaboration, which I think is very exciting. So just touching on that topic further, I mean, Australia is not the only one that has ambitions in the APAC region, I think it's fair to say. So recently, the Philippines has come out very strongly with a lot of attractive opportunities for investors, and I think that they're very keen to push forward their role in the Southeast Asian region and to collaborate with other countries around the world. So there's currently 60 gigawatts of service contracts being awarded in the Philippines, so a market with considerable volume. Also looking at Vietnam, which has recently passed its Power Development Plan 8, which will kind of unblock the next stage of offshore wind in Vietnam, and they've got a target for offshore wind of 6 gigawatts there. And then looking at some of the Pacific countries, Japan and South Korea, also looking at offshore wind, looking at floating wind as well, with quite some detail and ambition there. I think the collection of countries in the APAC region share some similar challenges. So I already mentioned supply chain. I think this point around scale is one where also Australia has really kind of got the memo, I guess, about how to hopefully put scale into the market. And I think we're really seeing that in the emerging offshore wind markets that are successful, that putting out both ambition and then having a detailed roadmap for the implementation of that ambition is what drives investors to want to invest. Final point, and then I'll just wrap up. But Australia is in a competitive marketplace for investment. I think, as I said, it's made a really good strides to establishing itself. People around the world, or investors around the world, are looking at Australia as a very exciting opportunity. But it's also not the only country, only place in town. So I think we welcome further ambition regarding implementation from the Australian government to really now kind of seal the deal here and keep on learning from those kind of international best practices.
Thanks, Rebecca. And we'll come back to certainly supply chain in a second. I just want to maybe throw to Jonathan or Michael. I mean, we've seen over the last months a bit of a reset, if you like, for some of the global offshore wind markets. Some of the challenges with project delivery, with project costs, some of the reflection on some of the contract rounds that have had some challenges. Interested in your reflections on what's happening there, and in the context of Australia, again, a bit similar. What should we avoid? What are the lessons in, where now the Australian government's committed to the expanded capacity investment scheme, which is a contracting program. What are your reflections on all of that, and what should Australia avoid or make sure we focus on?
Sure. Okay. So a few things, and actually, I mean, this is relevant to Australia, but it's actually relevant to a lot of countries. In GWEC, we're spending a lot of time, I think, putting these messages across. I mean, first thing is, what's happening right now in the global sector is a reaction to macroeconomic factors that is probably causing a short-lived problem in what is otherwise a very long-term industry with very strong long-term fundamentals. And it's really important that we don't let the short-term problems undermine the long-term potential, and that we keep the faith. And what we really need to remember is that these are very long-cycle investment programs for offshore wind. And what we're talking about today in 2023, and have been talking about for the past 2 or 3 years, are going to deliver projects in the next decade, right? So, we shouldn't let today's problems become an obstacle to delivering something, because 10 years from now we'll regret if we slow down. So keeping the faith is really important, right? But one other thing that it does throw up, which I think is quite relevant actually for Australia, is around the question of route to market and pricing and the pacing of that. So, one thing is a recognition about what price needs to be paid for something like offshore wind, and how do you value that? Okay, and this is a question which has been pretty relevant recently. This should not really be a question of how does offshore wind compare to what we used to pay for thermal power 10 years ago. It should be a question of what's the value of offshore wind to our economy, to our society, and what's the counterfactual? How does it compare to what we would otherwise be having to do 10 years from now if we didn't have offshore wind? And if you have that ability to take that view, then you can set a much more progressive long-term approach to pricing. The other thing that we've learned is that pacing of price setting is really important, right? It's important to set a price early enough in the life of a project to give developers, like Michael and I, the confidence that we need to make the big investments to move these projects forward, especially if you're trying to stimulate other investments like ports and things like that, supply chain, right? On the other hand, it's important that that price setting point is at a point in time where enough is known about the project to know what the cost of supply is actually going to be and set an accurate, viable price. And when that price is set, that there's some capacity to deal with macroeconomic changes, and the price can somehow adjust for inflation and commodities and things like that. That seems to be the way that things are moving in other markets. And the other thing that's important is when you've got a system like Australia where you're putting a lot of volumes into the market at once, and let's be honest, we're at a bit of a high point in terms of the pricing curve just now. You don't want to necessarily put all the contract setting prices out too early, because then you're buying everything at a high point. What you need to do is put it out staggered. And what's really important for the industry then is that you give visibility of how regular those processes are going to be, when they're going to come, what the parameters are going to be, and then you get a much more sustainable approach to bidding auctions. And what naturally tends to happen then is that the most efficient, lowest cost projects will win first and go first, and the later projects will come later, by which time market efficiencies and other efficiencies will have come in and brought the price down. And so over the long term, you get a much more stable, even digressing price curve. So I think that the lessons that we see right now are really relevant to Australia, but everywhere else in terms of keeping the faith, but being sensible about price setting and our approach to price setting. Hope that makes sense.
Michael, anything to add or anything to disagree with Jonathan on?
No, I do not disagree to it, but maybe make it a little bit more simple. Some of the things you are referring to, for example, US, that's a little bit a structural problem, right? That's, you can say, an offtake price was given, it was not indexed, and then on the other hand, there was kind of a cliff edge from when you needed to have installed your project. So there was no flexibility for when you could actually procure, deliver. And then when you have a fixed kind of revenue stream secured and there's no kind of flexibility on when you are to install, then you need to bite the apple and maybe it's a sour apple. So I think some of the things Jonathan said was around make sure that it is an indexed revenue stream, make sure that there are some flexibility in when you are to deliver the power, and then the market will basically find out how it can work the best in bringing capacity to the market and actually do it at a fair market price, because that's needed. If there's one thing I should add, and that's of course what we should avoid with the offshore wind in Australia, that is Australia unfortunately got this negative, it's a stop and go market for onshore. Now we should build a continuation in the market flow of things for offshore so that we can get the full supply chain to see that there was lessons learned on the stop and go, and now there will be predictability, there will be volume, and it's all right what is happening now, so let's just continue on that one. And what I really like with Australia is that they are so open for listening, for consultations, for getting inputs. I think that is actually the reason for Australia being kind of setting the pace for APAC region now.
Yeah, maybe I'll just jump in and say just a couple of words here. So on the UK auction, which maybe falls into this bucket of kind of blips or market corrections that we've been seeing, I also just want to kind of hopefully set the record a bit straight on that one. So I think that the UK auction that didn't attract any bidders also basically went a bit wrong because of a kind of administrative error in policy-making judgment. And I think that the administrative strike prices, so the maximum price that can be awarded in the auction, were just set too low for people to take it seriously, and as a result we saw no bidders. I mean, the good news there is that the UK government has really learned from that experience, has really now, recommitted, I guess, to how they see the benefits of offshore wind by putting it as central to their kind of energy security strategy. And they have revised the strike prices for the next auction. So I guess, there was a learning point there for everyone involved, and it's now been corrected, which I think is a positive signal that we're seeing coming out of some of these challenges that we have seen globally. And then maybe just a comment on the overall trajectory of offshore wind. I mean, we see globally just huge global growth. It was global growth. It was the second highest year for offshore wind globally last year. APAC and the region of APAC is set for a huge boom. Australia is accounting for some of that very exciting prospect that we're seeing. So this is a story of momentum, a story of excitement, and a story of growth. I think there are certain factors and certain markets where we've had challenges. There are these macroeconomic factors that all sectors across the economy are dealing with. But really, the story here is one of opportunity and growth, and I want to make sure that the audience continues to understand that.
Yeah, point well made. Might go to supply chain next. I mean, we know that supply chain is such a critical part of the, of the journey and development of the offshore wind sector. Australia isn't at the we're not centrally located geographically. We don't have a lot of that supply chain in country at the moment. But I guess interested in the panel's reflections on what do we need to do? What's the balance of what can we expect to develop locally? How do we manage that? What are the signals we need to maximise local development of supply chain?
Well, I can start it up. It's of course it comes a little bit with what I said about predictability and volume. So for example, if a country would like to have a value chain with own turbine manufacturing, then rule of thumb is that you need 1.5 gigawatt per year in a number of years to run one factory for turbines. If you then want to have competition in the market, which can be smart, then you need 3 gigawatt per year in that market. So you can say a lot of countries could benefit from actually teaming up in regions. And as Rebecca said, that there is a huge growth in the region. And that is basically falling in a time where also Europe have really, really high targets. So Europe will not be super busy in exporting to APEC if Europe they are to deliver on their targets. Europe will have to more than double turbines, have to more than quadruple tubular steels for towers and foundations, will have to more than double on vessels. So there should be a fantastic opportunity for the APEC region if they collaborate and basically look at what are the individual strengths, what are they good at, and then they supply that to the neighboring countries in the region. So I see it as a fantastic opportunity for actually doing what offshore is really good at, creating jobs, creating regional jobs in the local area. And that will also help, of course, that Australia is located quite a distance from where you see it today. So I see fantastic opportunities.
Kushla, do you want to maybe make some comments? I mean, the government's obviously recognised economy-wide, whether it's leveraging our critical minerals, whether it's rejuvenating our manufacturing sector more widely. I mean, your reflections on the opportunity and the role for government in developing that supply chain for offshore wind?
I think part of it is, and just listening to Michael talk about the regional collaboration, and it's an interesting one between collaboration, what would have been competition, and then that role of government. And that's the part where you're sort of saying, well, government to government, well, we could do this, we could start to think about the sequencing, but then kind of fundamentally knowing it will be about the companies who are developing this. And so I do sometimes think there's a gap between some of that discussion and then really what would that mean? And so, and again, we don't exactly know what the commercial pathways will look like. And there's just, but to some extent, even like some of the balance of plant or building opportunities are kind of extraordinary. I think other things when we were developing the legislation, there's always a question about, well, what's the amount of local content? And there were some really salient examples, at least in the startup phase, what I took away in Spain, where they had really high local content requirements, and it just actually meant their industry stalled for a long time before they could go forward. And so it is those sorts of understandings, discussions, consultations before saying, well, the Australian government will do X or Y, because we are talking about, from the licensing as we understand, potentially around 7 years. We don't have long, but we also would want to get it right. So that's how I'd put it.
Rebecca, and then I might come to Jonathan in terms of what the priority areas are for local supply chain. But Rebecca, your sort of global perspective?
Yeah, well, I want to plug a report that we're putting out today, shamelessly, which looks at the global supply chain. It maps it across areas and also across scenarios. So it's a report we've done with Boston Consulting Group. It's quite a good level of detail, I think you'll find, and it goes from nacelles, turbines, vessels, right through to critical raw materials. What the report finds is that there's only kind of one scenario where the global growth of offshore wind is aligned to 1.5 degrees, and that's a scenario where We don't have highly restrictive trade barriers where there is a globalized flow of commodities and products. So I would encourage you to all take a look at that report, because I think it would be very useful to you in your planning. But maybe just kind of commenting on the supply chain perspective, I think the countries where we've seen the greatest kind of wins from a supply chain perspective have been the ones that have taken industrial strategy and cross-sectoral strategies very seriously. They haven't looked at offshore wind in isolation, but they've looked at offshore wind as an opportunity, amongst others, to really drive value into the economy, and done that in detail, and done it in an aligned way with the rollout of offshore wind. And I think now, actually, we see globally that there are some governments which are kind of struggling to make up lost ground in this regard. I guess the UK is maybe, an example of that now there's a lot of detailed work being undertaken in the UK to try and now pinpoint an industrial strategy that drives further content. So I think it's this balance, like you were saying, Kushla, of getting it right between speed and scale, local content, and then the kind of policies and procedures being aligned, that you put in place being aligned to the rollout of offshore wind in sequence, so you can maximize those benefits. And that's where we've seen most success globally.
Okay, so, I think looking back over the many years we've been working in offshore wind and working with a lot of governments about how they grow their industry. Generally the supply chain responds to three things. One is proximity. So you will find supply chain will grow where it makes sense to do it near the asset, right? Now, it used to be that was big bits of kit that were difficult to move. Nowadays, not so much. What you do find, though, is that most of the services, the O&M, some of the kind of white-collar jobs associated with offshore wind, they will be done locally. And those are high-value jobs that last for decades, right? So they're not to be sniffed at. That's the first thing. Second thing is where you're addressing a failure in the market. And so there's an undercapacity and the capacity needs to be built. That will be built somewhere, and that usually responds to volumes, as Michael said. Usually there's a throughput of 100 units a year or something like that pays a factory out over 5 years. The challenge in a lot of APAC countries right now is seeing those volumes over that time frame is tough, right? And so I don't think you can rely just on that alone. And that's why what you were saying, Kushla, is a really smart thing. We were meeting yesterday with a bunch of other APAC countries to look at some kind of regional collaboration or aggregation model as to how do you bring all this demand together and align the timing of it and align the demands to try and create a regional supply chain storyline that the supply chain can invest in response to. And then the third thing is around things like intellectual property. If you invest in the skills and the technology and the intellectual property, then you will tend to capture quite a good amount of the supply chain. And again, I think that's where progressive governments, and I think you certainly fall into that category of progressive governments, investing up front in skills and education and innovation is a really smart thing to do for the long term, because you will then capture a lot of the high value jobs. And so what you should be looking at is your industrial strategy is focusing on the bits of your of the industry that you want to capture in your economy. Do you want to go head to head on the cost of a welder with a Middle Eastern fabrication yard, or do you want to capture the bits of the industry which are based on advanced manufacturing and digitalization and high degrees of intellectual property? And that's the kind of decision that a country like Australia needs to make in setting out its strategy. The other thing, I think one of the reasons why offshore wind makes sense, and it makes sense in Australia for a lot of reasons, the resource is great, the fundamentals, the physical characteristics of the projects are very good, it's complementary to the other renewable resources, etc. But the other thing that's really good is in places like Latrobe, where it's not just an energy successor to thermal, it's an economic successor. And there's a lot of existing skills and supply chain already there, ready to reskill. And so focusing efforts on getting ahead of that is a really important thing to do. And investing to remove the big enablers like ports. The reason why the UK never captured its fair share of supply chain is because, sorry to say, the ports were all in private ownership and the investment signals to the private owners never came on time, whereas the publicly owned ports on the west coast of Europe were taking all the supply chain because they were taking those barriers away early. So using things like Hastings and others to really remove that barrier early is a smart thing to do. So, sorry, a bit of a diatribe, but that's my view on it.
No, I feel like we could have a whole nother hour just talking about ports and obviously days talking about supply chain. We don't have a lot of time left, and I do want to pick up on particularly the community piece. Probably, Jonathan, you made the point of the co-location and the interconnection between offshore wind and some of the heavy industry regions, the Hunter, the Illawarra, the Latrobe Valley, etc. Just hold your horses. But I guess interested in reflections, I might throw to you, Kushla, actually, in terms of the community piece. We've seen, obviously, a real voice and, if you like, a campaign, particularly in the Illawarra recently, which I'd be really interested in your reflections on that. And probably most importantly, what does it say for the industry and how the industry needs to conduct itself, engage with local communities and go forward?
Thanks, Kane. I think it'd be well understood, everyone here, you have to work with communities, you have to have the social licence. And maybe I won't talk so much about Illawarra, but just reflecting on actually what has happened in Gippsland. And there was really deep engagement, I know, by Star of the South over a very long period of time. And you can sort of see through the community consultation that happened, obviously, when you're looking to issue the feasibility licences, that's absolutely critical. But more importantly, where companies have really been engaging well, then you just know. You've seen that onshore, and you will see that in terms of communities most affected, I think, or potentially benefit, obviously, from the offshore wind developments. There is work going on. It's incredibly prominent as we think about the transmission lines, but all renewable energy developments in Australia. There will be reports coming out very soon on that. But more importantly, we know that this comes down to the industry engagement. And of course, as governments, we always have to we'll put in place the right rule set. But really, it will come down to the quality of that engagement, from my perspective.
Jonathan?
Okay, thanks. So first thing to say is this. I mean, when you're building offshore wind, what you're doing is you're building infrastructure that's going to last in communities for generations, right? So we all know, having been in this industry for a long time, that you have to do this with communities and for communities, not to communities, or you're destined to fail. So that, no question, as an industry, offshore wind globally has a really proud track record of engaging communities early on environmental issues, but also on socio-economic issues and things like that, right? So no issue with that. I think in Australia as well, I mean, I really like the fact that Australia has this really high concept of social licence and really proud of the ecosystem and really protective of it, right? And we as an industry absolutely will respect that and respect the rights of the traditional owners. That's in our DNA to behave like that. And so I think you can, what you're saying, Kushla, is, it's on the industry to be very engaging, to be very proactive, to communicate very well, to show the benefits, etc. That's absolutely right. Now, just to throw a little bit back to Kushla then, this is where actually the permitting process in the framework is really, really important, especially where you have a multi-layered state. So you've got like a Commonwealth government, you've got state governments, you've got local governments, you've got a whole load of different non-government organisations and stakeholders. That has to be managed really tightly so that process engages correctly, it respects local democracy, it protects the environment, it makes science-based decisions, but it's done in a streamlined, efficient way, and it gets the prioritisation right. And sometimes there is a concept of overriding interest that has to take effect, and that means that not every stakeholder gets everything they want. And that takes a bit of political courage, and it takes a bit of regulatory courage to make that happen. And there are other markets where that balance between the different layers isn't right, where there's too many touch points, which effectively can become ransom points, and the industry stalls for years. And I don't think we want that. I don't think Australia can afford that. I don't think the planet can afford that. So getting that right, I would encourage, if it can be done, I think you are talking about this, some kind of one-stop shop federal agency that's going to try to align all of the different permitting processes and try to reuse data in a smart way and try to make these decisions in as much alignment as possible to try to make that an efficient but very effective and very fair and transparent process.
Yeah, I totally agree, Jonathan. I think I think that's been the lesson from other sectors and industries. I think at some point in time it does require some leadership and courage, but I think that will only occur if it's been very evident that the industry has done the right thing by the community, and I think there's some lessons in that. I think as a nation and an industry, I think we've been very well served by the leadership of Star of the South in particular. I think it's set a really high bar for community engagement, economic benefit sharing, etc. And I think credit to Star of the South for that investment and work. It does set a high bar, and I think sets expectation for businesses around the country. As you said, we're in a slightly different regulatory environment now. Michael, any reflections in terms of the community piece and what we need to pay a lot more attention to?
I think it's basically seen that we need to pay a lot of attention to gain a social license, and it's not something that you can fix overnight. It is something which is a year-long consultation period. There will be naysayers, and you will have to meet them, and you will have to meet them in eye height, and you will have to be there, and you will have to be there several times and discuss, because you're bringing something new to them that they do not know. In Europe, we know about offshore wind because it was founded there. Now we are bringing it in from the outside. So it's a long, hard work, but it's actually also a fun work, because when there is a mission and you have the energy to go and do this, then you meet a lot of good people. And I have been there. I've been sitting on random cafes, having talks in the Gippsland area, and that's how you talk about offshore wind. You meet people and you talk about it, and then you call people for gatherings, and then you ask them for their concerns and everything. It's just something that you need to gain, and it's not something you can buy.
Speaking of community engagement, we're going to throw to the audience now an opportunity for questions from the floor. We've got a roving microphone. We've only got a few minutes, but if people wanted to, any questions, any burning topics we haven't covered.
Thank you very much. Christophe Godard, Director of the Ocean Institute at the University of Western Australia. Thank you very much to the panelists for sharing your expertise and the very positive message about offshore wind, which I fully support. I just want to be a bit devil's advocate just for 1 second, So 3 points that we haven't touched. The first one is a significant research effort which is needed, to underpin the development of offshore wind, notably about understanding the environmental impact in the very unique marine ecosystem in Australia. And we know with the stories in Illawarra that it's very much linked to social licensing. We've got very notorious challenging seabed in Australia, and so we want to make sure that the research is done to not replicate the mistakes that the oil and gas industry did in the 80s. We know also that there is significant upgrade of the port infrastructure that are required. We haven't discussed that. And we also know that there is a very fierce competition for offshore assets across the world for installation and so on. So with all of that acknowledged, just a simple question. When do you think we will see the first offshore wind turbine in Australia? And how much installed capacity we can expect by 2040? When we hear that some of the talks around is that we need 40 gigawatt by 2040 to reach the net zero target and so on. So thank you very much.
Thank you. There's a lot in that question or comments we probably don't have time for. Michael, I'm going to throw to you. First offshore wind turbine in Australia, what year?
It will, of course, be interesting to see how big they will be. You can say the data have shown that the turbine price per megawatt is going up now. So somehow the turbine in itself will be more expensive per megawatt. That also means that the saving you will have to see is basically then on the infrastructure, less foundations and less cables. However, what you also see is that the current type of vessels, they are challenged with the already existing size. So the jacking system, when they are to jack out, the cranes that they are to lift with, they are challenged. And if you look at it, then with the high build out that we need to see now, then personally, I would rather say that a plateau for a number of years in the size would be good. It would be good for industry, it would be good for developers, it will be good for countries, because then you can stabilize and you can use kind of existing infrastructure, and you will not have to build new harbors everywhere. And you will likely see failure rates going down on the technical components, and then you will actually see that you can run more efficient, and that will more than outgain. Whether there will be larger turbines, maybe, and especially the floating foundations are scaling positively for a larger turbine. But I will not give you my best guess. I keep that.
But very diplomatic. Rebecca?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to the points you made about kind of delicate ecosystems, biodiversity, and how the offshore wind sector is thinking about these issues. And I think it's fair to say that for too long, the kind of climate and ocean nexuses have been, completely siloed. So even if we look at the kind of UNFCCC process that exists in one part, and there's a kind of oceans process, which is completely different stakeholders. But actually, I think offshore wind is, in my experience, doing quite a nice job now of kind of knitting these concerns together. And actually, from the GWEC perspective, it's something we're giving a lot of thought to. Tomorrow, we're actually launching a new NGO, which will hopefully help governments with some kind of more technical capability. But the other point of this NGO is to further the dialogue between the offshore wind industry and sector and NGOs, in particular environmental NGOs, and try to work together towards some shared solutions in this space. We all know that the marine environment is very crowded. It's not just biodiversity, but also all the other users of the seabed. And many countries are kind of approaching this seabed mapping process for the very first time with this complex interrelationships to deal with. I think it is an area where we have made good progress. There's still a lot to learn in terms of how we kind of measure some of the impacts in the sea. But at the same time, there's this need for kind of to iterate and to continually improve how we gather data, how we address some of these challenges and the models and processes we put in place, because we can't afford to stand still from a climate perspective, but we also need to get it right from a biodiversity perspective. There's quite a few events, I think, happening on this very topic at COP, and I'm very pleased to connect with you afterwards around them.
Thanks, Rebecca. We've got 2 minutes left. I'm going to ask for each of you 30 seconds or less. Really just some quick reflections on the COP itself. I guess, how's it progressing? What's the relevance to offshore wind, and what your expectations are between now and the end of the COP? 30 seconds each.
Great that we got tripling of renewables as adopted as a formal pledge just the other day. Now the hard work continues. We're trying to drive that into the COP text itself, hoping for support from countries that are around us. And I think the signal that sends globally for offshore wind is that offshore wind has never been more important and is an integral part of that tripling.
Thanks. So, yes, that tripling thing, getting that done so early in this COP is really significant, because it means that we don't spend time talking about whether and why we should have offshore wind. We now talk about how we do it, and that's what this is now all about. The next stage of this, after the language, is putting the enablers in place to make it happen and setting the right accountability mechanisms to actually hold each other to account to make it happen. The industry's ready to respond. The money is available to invest. We now just need to take that next step, and that's what the next kind of 10 days or whatever we've got should be focusing a lot then on going to the next stage.
So, this COP is like the global stock take, right? Where are we? What do we have to do next? So absolutely, Australia was so proud to be able to join tripling of renewables pledge. And I am always fascinated, in some ways, from coming out of the negotiation rooms into where all the people are having fun in different areas, to try to really understand what does it mean. And it gives me hope, it gives me confidence that you understand that when these signals are given, that's another form of legitimacy, and it's another form just to push others forward. And for that, we're incredibly thankful.
Kushla, I think I saw you at the Global Renewable Alliance event last night, having fun. I think if your question is where are the people having fun is the most progress.
I worked it out and I got out of the negotiating rooms and went. That's right.
Michael?
No, the reflection from my side, I really, really like the tripling up because that is what is needed. The cool thing is, all the technologies needed, they exist. So those of you who try to say that we will have to wait for a new technology or some smaller nuclear decentralized and put in place, no. All the technologies, they exist. We have the renewables, we have the storage capabilities, we have the combination of it. So everything exists. It's actually, as Jonathan is rightfully saying, how do we then implement it? And it starts by just doing it. It starts by issuing some permits, some consents, get going, and then learn while going. Because we should all remember that we can do a lot of renewables, but we cannot renew time. So it's now.
Great. So we are out of time. It sounds like we're off to a flyer on the COP. A lot to do in the next 10 days and focus on the execution and delivery. Certainly in our conversation now on offshore wind, we've only just really touched on those challenges, I think, in the next stages of delivery. A lot to do, whether it's about community, about supply chain, about the regulatory and licensing regime. We're pointing in the right direction, but a lot of hard work to do. And thank you. I know each of you and your organisations are intimately involved in that. The Clean Energy Council just last week released and launched our offshore wind task force, bringing together 50 or 60 of the leading offshore wind businesses in Australia with GWEC and many of the Australian governments and regulatory bodies. So we've got a lot of work to do, but I think we're really well positioned to learn from the global leaders in experience, bring that to Australia and make sure that this time next year we're even further progress and on track towards contributing to tripling renewables by 2030. So thank you very much to all of you for joining. Please can you join me in thanking an excellent panel.